Welcome to the Strategic Leader Podcast with me, Gemma Bullivant, and my co-host, Fiona Craig. This podcast is for HR professionals and people-focused leaders from any function who want to think, act, and feel naturally more strategic. Enjoy the show. Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Hi, Fiona. Welcome back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Gem. Thank you for holding the court last week with Jo, who I thought did an excellent job. I really enjoyed listening to last week's episode.
Yeah, we had a great conversation about conflict avoidance. And it was good, actually, because I've worked with Jo, and so I happen to know her stance and her refreshing stance on conflict avoidance. So I was really hoping that she'd be up for a conversation about that topic.
It was great. And I learned something from you every time, but it's always nice to learn something from somewhere else. So thank you to Jo for stepping in. And equally, it's nice to be back. I guess what we're talking about this week is, I don't know, it doesn't feel a million miles away from conflict avoidance. I think that when there may be a bit of an overlap in today's subject, would you say?
Yes, I think there's an overlap in a lot of these things, isn't there? But yes, there will be some areas where it overlaps into other things, including conflict avoidance. But yes, the topic of today is people pleasing.
Would you describe yourself as a people pleaser, Gem?
Yes, I would. It resonates with me, the whole topic of people pleasing. What do we think it is? I think for me, people pleasing is trying to be of service, be helpful, not let people down, be liked by other people. Often what that means is that you're prioritizing what somebody else needs or wants over what you might need or want.
And I think that last bit is the critical bit, isn't it? Because those first things that you said, you kind of go, well, why is that a problem? Where's the problem in that? Why is being a people pleaser not universally a wonderful thing? Being of service, being liked, being helpful. But it's that end bit, isn't it? Which is there is a consequence to that when it's taken too far.
Mm.
An unintended consequence on you, the individual. But also, I would argue, it also has an unintended consequence, or certainly has the potential to, for either the person that you're pleasing in the moment, or indeed any number of other stakeholders. So I guess it's that point about when it goes too far, there's an impact on you. There's also potentially an impact on all your other stakeholders in the mix, which might be other parts of the business. It might even be the business strategy itself. So I guess what we're saying is those traits on their own are not the problem. It's when those traits are taken too far.
And in relation to this podcast is particularly when it interferes with or hinders your ability to be a strategic leader. And there's two parts to that. There's hindering your ability to be strategic, which sometimes requires some provocation or a difference of opinion, which I suppose is somewhat where the overlap with conflict avoidance comes in. But there's also the aspect of being a leader. Being a leader in its fullest sense, what you are expected, or you want to get the best out of your people, develop your people, engage, inspire people, and people feel most inspired when they are given some space and some development opportunity. That we'll talk a little bit more about what can happen about people pleasing, but that link to leadership is very clear as well to me.
I agree massively. I think in a way that one of the big lessons of leadership is being willing on occasion to step into an unpopular position. Be that telling people stuff they don't necessarily want to hear, or holding a line that you know is temporarily unpopular. I think it's being able to be willing and ready on when needed to sacrifice your short-term popularity for long-term respect. The best leaders are willing to do that. They're willing to put themselves, hopefully temporarily, in an unpopular position, to say, no, I'm sorry, I hear you. I hear it's not popular. I hear you don't love it, but we have really thought it through and this is what we're going to be doing. And I do expect you to get on board. That's potentially a really unpopular position to put yourself in. sometimes that kind of position is necessary. And hopefully over the long term, that actually generates respect rather than hopefully you've made the right decision in the first place. But it's about sacrificing short-term popularity, I think, for longer-term respect. And that is really hard to do, I think, if you are not willing to make yourself unpopular with individuals or groups in the moment,
Mm,
which I would see as part of that people pleasing. I don't want to hold that line when I know you're not happy
yeah.
with me.
Oh, yes. And saying yes to things because it feels deeply uncomfortable to say no, because I feel like I'm letting someone down, or I feel like that person is going to struggle with that, especially if I know that I could help them if only I had the time. At times, I take on far more than I've got the capacity to. And I think that's where that comes from.
So I'm not going to ask you this directly because I'm sure you've got this under control. But I mean, that does feel fairly typical of a people pleaser, which is I don't want to say no to people, even if I don't really have the time. I don't want to say no to them because it feels really uncomfortable if I could potentially help them.
Mm,
Is thinking about the impact of saying yes in that situation. What would
mm.
be the impact of saying yes under those circumstances?
Well, the impact on me as the individual is that I have workload overwhelm, feel deeply stressed because I haven't got the time because I need to move on to the next thing because I've said yes to something else.
Hmm.
So there's a well-being impact, I suppose, on myself and my sense of overwhelm and stress levels, but there's also potentially an impact on the quality of work that can be produced because you've not left yourself enough time. I tend to compensate for that by just working longer hours,
Yes,
and
but
so
I know as your friend that you have a stonking social life. And so the compromise will be somewhere. So the compromise may not be on the quality of the work in that instance, but it will be somewhere, won't it?
well, I think my stonking social life is mostly due to my husband's addiction to Ticketmaster. But if I think back to my time as a leader, if I was taking everything on and not delegating it in the right way, then I'm also doing a bit of a disservice to the people in my team because that's actually their opportunity to grow and develop, to do something that maybe they don't have an immediate answer to, whereas I might be able to do it quite quickly. But actually, they need to learn for themselves.
I think that's quite a key one, isn't it? And I think possibly a bit of a hidden downside of people pleasing, which is if you were to go around solving other people's problems for them, then you are potentially denying them the opportunity of building up those problem solving skills on the
Mm,
one hand, because we know that we learn better when we do stuff for ourselves than when someone just tells us
mm,
the answer. And the other thing is that it kind of builds up a pattern of behavior with our workmates
mhm,
where the more likely I am to take a problem off your desk, to take the monkey off your back, the more likely you are to come and dump your monkey on me.
mhm,
And the more
mm.
likely I am to do it, the more I feel like I need to do it because you seem to have lots of monkeys. But really, it's just that I keep bringing them to you to take off me.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that whole "is it your monkey" question is something that comes up quite a lot in coaching, with
Likewise.
clients of mine. So I'm thinking of a client in particular who talks about the enormous number of meetings that they have in any given day, and then another meeting request comes in, and the automatic response from this person is to accept that meeting, even though it now has eaten up the only available hour in the day where any work could get done. And we've had some really interesting conversations about, well, whose monkey is that? Is that meeting for that person, or is that meeting for both of you or for you? Who's going to get the most benefit out of that meeting?
Mm.
And invariably, it's the other person's needs, it's the other person's timings, it's the other person's set of priorities that they're actually meeting by getting the meeting in your diary, but you're not meeting any of your own needs by doing that. You're actually doing yourself out of the opportunity to do the things that you need to do.
And if we're thinking strategically, then we're thinking longer term, we're thinking a sort of helicopter perspective. we should be able to plan out our time
Mm,
with a real sense of sort of purpose and autonomy.
mm,
And we should be able to, have a few gaps that you can donate to other people in the heat of the moment. But I'm coming back to this idea of, being strategic and intentional with your personal resources. And
mm,
obviously time is probably the main one. If you just accept a meeting for like later on this afternoon or tomorrow or the next day, that would suggest to me that you're not necessarily thinking strategically about where can I add the most value today? Where can I
mm,
add the most value this week? What is my biggest priority this week?
mm,
And how is this extra meeting helping or hindering? As a slight aside, I would love if I could make a cultural change in the workplace. I would love to make it absolutely okay to not attend meetings that
mm.
you're invited to.
Yes.
I mean, like the whole thing, you don't attend every party you're invited to. Like the automatic assumption that if you invite me, I will accept, I think needs to change
Yes.
massively.
It really does, and I think it's come from the technology of calendar invites,
It really does.
because back in the day, you had to sort of have a bit of a conversation about, "Are you free then? Are you free then? Shall we meet then?" Whereas now, we've got open access to each other's calendars often, and it just kind of happens. And the instinct is to hit accept if there is a gap. And especially if you're not in the habit, this is a whole other topic for another day, but if you're not in the habit of blocking your calendar out with the actual activity that you've got
Mm,
to do, not just meetings,
mm,
using your calendar to the full extent of what your day needs to look like, so that you can remind yourself that you have no more time. Just because you haven't got a meeting doesn't mean you've got the time to have whatever that meeting request is that's come in. But you see, then even if I've made the categoric decision to say no to something, that I can't take on or do something, or I don't want to take on or do something, I then feel really uncomfortable about saying no. Even though I know that's what I want, it feels uncomfortable. And I can remember, I mean, I probably still do it from time to time, although I have got a lot better at it. Kind of taking ages crafting the decline email, the apologetic email, sometimes researching things that might be helpful to that person because I can't, is there somebody else that can help you instead of me? Like actually going out of my way to soften the no
mm.
with some other form of help, which at the end of the day is people pleasing. And it's not to say you completely eliminate those sorts of things, but it is to say that it needs to somewhat be in moderation. And I learned a really valuable lesson about this when I had agonized over one such email. And it was a couple of years ago now, but not when I was in house, but a couple of years ago. And I remember crafting this email reply. And then I remember taking it downstairs and reading it out to my husband just to check that he thought it was okay to send. We both agreed, or he obviously thought I was a lunatic, but we both agreed that that it was fine to send. And within, I don't know, a few minutes, I got a reply from this person asking, going, "Thanks, it's okay, I've got another option."
So you didn't need to go to all that trouble. So what I've heard from that story is that they didn't value that extra trouble you'd gone to because they absolutely didn't need it. They'd already moved on. They'd already got a backup plan. So your extra effort wasn't really of value to them.
And that for me was a really good lesson and a good reminder. And I think in some ways, because I have got a lot better at this, I think age helps and experience helps,
Mhm, mhm.
but also the experience side of things being things like that particular situation where I agonized over the email and within 5 minutes I got a very casual reply. I can now bring that back to mind when I next feel uncomfortable.
So I was going to ask you about this notion that if fundamentally you would describe yourself as a people pleaser and yet you have got a lot better. You said I got a lot better at this. So
Mm,
there must be this notion that you still want to say yes to everything, or you still want to give people the answer they want to hear, but somehow you have managed to kind of park that and put some tactics in place to
yes.
preserve some boundaries. Because I'm guessing that actually looking at the deep-seated rationale and driver for wanting, for being a people pleaser in the first place is probably the work of counselling or therapy of some description. It's not really the work of this conversation. But it
Yeah.
sounds like whatever the drivers behind that, and we all have something, right? It's still possible to work around it in a practical sense and say, well, just because I feel uncomfortable doesn't mean I have to say yes. I can still say no.
Absolutely. And that's fundamentally one of the main things that coaching can really help with, isn't it? Because we can learn to recognize our behaviors and our habits and our routine and our instinct. And we're not necessarily getting down into the absolute depths of what that instinct, where that instinct comes from. All we're doing is we're saying, okay, so I have a tendency to people please. I have a tendency to feel really uncomfortable saying no to something. I have a tendency to feel uncomfortable setting boundaries at times that protect my interests as well as not unduly harming somebody else's. So I can then learn to recognize that discomfort, but still do the right thing or the thing that feels like the right thing to do in relation to my needs as well as their needs.
So you mentioned in their boundaries and you talked about the right thing in relation to my needs and their needs. How do we practically start to lean into that boundary setting? Have you got, I'm sure you have, a top tool that we can refer
Mm.
to help us if we've got a gravitational pull in one direction and yet we have this sense that it's probably not always the best direction to go in? What I notice in language terms when people are describing, for example, I'm a people pleaser and I realize that that's not quite right, but I don't want to be the person to always say no. And they've made a massive leap from always saying yes on one side to always saying no. And it feels like, well, there's a whole gulf in the middle. There's a whole delta in the middle of many, many possible other combinations of what this could look like.
Well, yes. I mean, I often refer to lots of things as being on a bit of a continuum. And I think here we've got a passive aggressive continuum. So, on the one hand, on the left hand side of the continuum is passive behavior, which is to say, not necessarily doing nothing, but acquiescing to the other person's needs, saying yes to things when you don't necessarily have the time. That's a sort of a passive response to your own priorities. On the opposite side of the continuum, of course, is aggressive, is that always saying, no, your needs are not important to me. That whole idea that there is just, no help, no and no regard for the other person's needs or feelings or priorities. And that delta in the middle that you described is the middle of the continuum, which is assertive. Because if we think about it, there's a difference between being assertive and being aggressive. They're not the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Being assertive is that middle ground where your needs are important and so are the needs of the other person. So if somebody wants to meet me on Thursday afternoon and I know I've got a deadline to deliver something, I've got no time in my diary, rather than saying yes and then working into the night to finish what I need to do for that Friday deadline, I might say, I can't do today, but I do have some time tomorrow or next week. Would that still work for you? On the basis that we don't actually know what their timeline is. Just because they want to they want to meet you on that Thursday doesn't necessarily mean if they don't meet you on that Thursday, it's all going to fall over. So then that kind of, check in on whether it would work for them, not just practically in terms of calendars, but in terms of their needs. That's you asserting something that you need, but in a way that isn't aggressive because you're also acknowledging that the other person is in need of something too.
So it's a no but, which isn't a straight no, which might be in the aggressive side. It's a no, you can't have an hour, but you could have 5 minutes, or no, you can't have an hour today, but you could have an hour on Monday, for example. So it's balancing. So the way I've heard you describe it, then the passive position is your needs matter and mine don't. I'm not important here. And the
Mm.
aggressive position is my needs matter and yours don't, I am the important one here. And we're saying, well, actually, we're both important. Let's have a conversation, or let's have some kind of dialogue or some kind of negotiation or collaboration about how do we balance those two things out. We have our instinctive reactions. Our ancient brain will give us a very limited choice of very, very fast reactions to
Mm.
stimulus. So something that happens to us. We tend to think of fight and flight. There's
Yeah.
actually four. We have fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And I'm
Mm.
very much reminded that the passive position is the fawn position, which is, you'll see animals do it. They will literally bow down to other animals that they perceive to be superior, and they'll say, okay, you can have your way. And clearly we're talking animals, but you know what I mean? It's like I will fawn, I will sort of give you what you want. Whereas I suppose the aggressive position would be fight. I will literally fight you for this. But let's not
Yeah.
forget, those four reactions are very, very crude. Those are our ancient kind of lizard brain reactions. They come out very,
Yeah.
very quickly, but they don't give us much choice. They don't allow for our finely tuned executive function to kick in, which takes a fraction longer. If you can bring some kind of sense of pause to bear and go, hold on a second, if I give myself more options than just those four, of which I'd probably go with fawn, what would be a better response here? A more professional response, a more strategic response, a more considered response? What might be a no, but it'll be an
Mm.
assertive position, which is, I hear what you're asking for. I've also got to balance what I know is important in terms of my time or my resource or my expertise or my opinion. So I'm not going to give you what you want, but it doesn't mean it doesn't mean I disregard it. It means that, I guess, it brings us back to that. I'm willing in this moment to be slightly unpopular with you.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. And I'm desperately trying to think of a fifth word beginning with F that might summarize that really nicely, so that we've got fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and
Why do we need five?
uh, because it's a fifth thing to do.
Oh,
You're not doing fight, flight, freeze, fawn, but you're doing something else. But I don't have a word.
but this is why we don't write models. This is why we use other people's.
Yes, quite. So the response can be no if we're comfortable that that actually feels like the right response and we're not going too far down that continuum. So there are alternatives to the no, but I don't want to suggest that that's the answer all the time.
No, absolutely.
But there's certainly some lessons to be had from really thinking about past experiences where you have had the courage to be more assertive. Has that actually played out? Has that helped you, or has it helped the other person in terms of giving them the space to grow, develop, if that's the scenario, or that the other person has figured it out for themselves in some other way? And has it actually enabled other things? As you said, there's also that systemic perspective of through that role of being a strategic leader, you might need to either be unpopular, or you might need to be a little provocative or a little challenging, and you might need to feel uncomfortable but still do whatever is needed. It's not necessarily to say that you will never feel uncomfortable or that the aim is to get rid of that discomfort. In actual fact, the aim is to work with that discomfort and be at ease with it in such a way that means that you do the things that are needed in the moment.
Yeah, I think that recognition that because something is uncomfortable doesn't mean we can't do it. And you're great. You were a great example of that, saying, I have a preference for saying yes, but I recognize it does none of us any good if I always say
Mm.
yes. I guess there's that notion of, if we want to shift away from a people pleasing tendency that we recognize in ourselves, there's something around identifying our own boundaries and identifying actually what is most important here. If there was no one else in the mix, what do I think the right thing to do is? And really listening to yourself to establish your own boundaries. How would I like to be spending my time? What do I think is the right course of action? How would I like to proceed?
Mm.
And valuing that in that assertive space in the middle, what I think is important, my position is important, my views are important, to help build that muscle of, where does my boundary lie here? And
Yes.
then there's also, I think you hinted about it, but just kind of experiment with, What happens if I do step back from people pleasing in a few places? Do people even notice? Does it have a negative impact? Actually, am I opening up some space that they could grow into? This feels like one of those spaces where you could take that discomfort and go, okay, I am a bit uncomfortable about it. That's fine. But I can recognize the fact that I probably need to get better at this. So let's find some spaces to experiment.
And that's making me think of something that you and I have talked about before, because you've got something called a red line question, I think.
Oh,
Tell me
yes.
tell me about that. Tell us
Oh,
all about your red line
like
questions.
it's simply this, is what am I not okay with?
Mm.
And it's a question to ask yourself when you're kind of a bit puzzled, or you feel like you're out of control, or you feel like your needs are being ignored in some respect. What am I not okay with? I'm not okay with not being heard. I'm not okay with my time being stolen from me. I'm not okay with flopping from one person to the next person. I would prefer to do it like this. So, your answers will be your own, but just as a question to have in your bag, what are you not okay with?
I like that. As well as what am I not okay with, which I think is a really good question for us to pause and think about, is that whole question of when you're saying yes to something, what are you saying no to? What or who are you saying no to? It could be yourself. It could be the needs of other people, not necessarily the person asking something of you that you are wanting to please. You may actually not be pleasing a whole bunch of other people by trying to people please that one individual. When you say yes to something, what are you saying no to?
Yeah, that's a good one. That unearths the cost. There is a
Yes.
cost, isn't there, of people pleasing, which sometimes is not obvious.
Great. Well, I think we've done the topic some good justice there.
Well, I hope so too, and
Um,
I'm pleased to hear that. Yeah, I don't experience you as I think when we talk about people pleasing, I don't know. I feel like somebody who fawns, that word fawns, and I don't think you do at all. So I'm deeply curious to hear more about your propensity for saying yes to things that you should say no to.
Well, maybe I have managed to recognize the discomfort and do the sit in that middle space, in that assertive space, which is not a bad space. Assertive and aggressive
Yeah,
are different.
they are.
Assertive is a positive space. Assertive is a respectful space of your needs and a respectful space of other people's needs. And therefore, being assertive is not a dirty word. Being assertive is, I think, what we need to strive to achieve most of the time.
I think we need some T-shirts that says assertive is not a dirty word. I'd wear that.
Right, I'll just get onto the printers right now. Well, thanks very much, Fee. It's been great, and it's been great having you back. And listeners, I hope you found the conversation useful. If people pleasing resonates with you as it does with me, then hopefully there's been some pointers there to help with. Well, here we are. Here's my people pleasing now. I'm wanting to make sure that it's going to help you. So there we are.
I'll say, let's wrap up, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Strategic Leader. If you liked the episode, please subscribe to access more of our recordings. And if you think it'd be useful for someone else, please forward to them and leave a review. We base our content on questions we are regularly asked and what you want to know more about, so please do email us with any questions or comments to gemma@gemmabullivant.co.uk. And remember, you're already being more strategic than you realise.